Welcome, scholars, to your final review of the Q1 synthesis essay. Just a quick review over the task. On the Q1, you're asked to consider a series of texts which are all related to a central issue and synthesize information from at least 3 of those sources to develop a position on that issue. The issue on the Q1 will be something specific, and it will be pertinent to today's society. You'll be given between 6 and 8 texts to read, and those texts will come from a variety of sources, including newspaper articles, magazine articles, scholarly journal essays, websites, radio and television broadcast transcripts, those sorts of things. And somewhere in those 6 to 8 texts will be at least one visual text, which might be a chart, a graph, a political cartoon, a photograph, or an advertisement. Responding to the task, effective responses will take a complex position on the topic, acknowledging that the issue at hand is intricate and that everything has consequences. Effective responses will also generally demonstrate more skepticism than certainty, since realistic, pragmatic ideas are usually easier for an audience to accept than overly romanticized or idealized ones. Effective responses will also be argument-driven and organized around arguments. They will be clearly and thoroughly frame all synthesized source material by introducing what the reader needs to know about a source up front before relating any of the source's ideas via paraphrase or quotation. Effective responses will also synthesize ideas from sources which clearly help lend weight and depth to the student's discussion. Finally, effective responses will reference ideas from the sources accurately and faithfully, taking into account the context surrounding the ideas in the sources. To contrast with this, ineffective responses will often take an overly general, narrow, or simplistic position on the topic, treating the issue as a black or white or yes or no proposition. Ineffective responses will also generally argue a more naive position, perhaps ignoring practical concerns and focusing more on idealized or romanticized ideas or outcomes. Ineffective responses will typically be source-driven and or organized around examining sources rather than making arguments. Ineffective responses will typically fail to properly frame ideas from sources, making it difficult to determine where the information is coming from or why it matters. A lot of times you'll see just dropped quotations or that sort of thing in there with no source information prefacing that, and so it's just this floating quote, and it's very confusing. Ineffective responses will also synthesize the ideas which don't really lend anything to the student's discussion. The student will be seemingly pulling a quotation merely to have a quotation. Ineffective responses will also misinterpret ideas from a source, take statements out of context, or otherwise misrepresent what a source says. All right, some things to avoid on the Q1 specifically. Don't turn this essay into an examination of sources. The sources are provided to teach you about the topic and add depth to your discussion. Don't, though, organize your essay around which source you will discuss in which paragraph. That's the opposite way to approach this. Instead, organize around your ideas. Keep your ideas central to the essay. Next, don't misrepresent what a source says. Read very, very carefully. Every idea you paraphrase or every statement you quote must be given its proper context, the context surrounding, the author actually saying that idea or stating that idea. Don't, for instance, Frankenstein quotes together so that they say what you want them to say. That's just as bad as plagiarism. Next, don't assume everything in a text is authored by the author. A lot of texts will contain quotations themselves from other people. So make sure you always acknowledge both the source where you got the information and the actual author of that idea, who specifically said that. Next, don't treat all outside information equally. So you want to scrutinize information based on who authors it, who said that. For instance, what a doctor says about a medical condition carries much more weight than what a film star says about it. A company executive arguing how vital the company's products are doesn't carry as much weight, for instance, as a study conducted by an independent consumer advocacy group. So keep that sort of thing in mind as you're scrutinizing your sources. Next, don't just use parenthetical citation. Parenthetical citation is a tool we taught you in ninth grade, and unfortunately a lot of you use it as kind of a crutch for bad writing. Parenthetical citation is not an alternative to framing quotations and paraphrases. Parenthetical citation is a shortcut to help you avoid having to reframe multiple quotations and paraphrases from the same source. So if you have 2 or 3 things that you're relating that a source says, you don't have to keep reframing it with your sentences. You can just frame it the first time and then use parenthetical citation for each time after that. Next, don't ignore the other side in this kind of an essay. These are concrete issues that often have very specific sides or lines being drawn. Don't focus so much on the positive aspects of your position that you totally ignore the negative aspects and drawbacks. This makes you seem naive and uninformed, and there's really no excuse for being uninformed. All the pieces or the sources are right there. Yeah, there will always be differing points of view and different drawbacks to every solution. Otherwise, think of this, this wouldn't be an issue at all. Everyone would simply share the same opinions on it, and there would be no debate for you to write about. Next, don't skip reading any of the sources. Okay? You only have to synthesize information from 3 of them in your essay, but you're expected to read all 6, 7, or 8 of the sources and take all of them into consideration. If, for instance, you argue an idea and in doing so you completely ignore the obvious problems with that idea that are explicitly discussed in source F, your essay will suffer because your essay grader is going to assume you didn't read source F or didn't read it with any comprehension. Moving on to some keys to success for the Q1s. Here's what you should try to do. Make sure you treat the task as joining an already existing conversation. Establish what is being said before you yourself wade into this discussion and make your points. This is what AP Lang teachers often call, quote, conversing with the sources. And it's one of the big things that AP raters are looking for. Also, don't forget that sources can actually converse with one another. You may examine one source's ideas in terms of what another source says, for instance. As long as your discussion is still focused on arguing your point of view, your discussion can still be effective even if your sources are sort of conversing with one another. Next up, key to success, make sure you frame every reference to a source thoroughly. Whether paraphrasing or quoting, it doesn't matter. You still have to frame that idea. You want to introduce the source and provide context surrounding the ideas you are bringing to your essay. Do this before any quoted words or paraphrased ideas. Next, use direct quotation purposefully and paraphrase everything else. When a direct quotation would help your essay, use it. Okay? For instance, use it when the exact wording would shed light on some idea. Use direct quotation when the author's own words are needed to carry weight to some idea. Use direct quotation when hearing something straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak, would be beneficial to your argument. And paraphrase everything else. There's just no need to quote when you don't need to. Next up, be precise in your paraphrases. Remember, paraphrases are done for specific ideas, and so you want to paraphrase just one idea at a time. You should be able, in other words, to, after writing a paraphrase, point to the spot in the source where the author says as much in that text. If your paraphrase is simply an idea that's sort of the gist of these 4 paragraphs in source A, that's not quality synthesis. That's what the scoring guidelines refer to as merely alluding to knowledge gained from the source without actually citing ideas in the source. Next up, be careful with statistics and numbers. Raw data needs critical interpretation. Be careful you don't draw conclusions from data that doesn't support those conclusions. And don't extrapolate wild generalizations about larger populations given only small, isolated sample sets. Another key to success that I talked about in class, skip those visual sources which don't make obvious statements. Okay? If you have a visual that is widely open to interpretation, stay away from it in your essay. Feel free to steal ideas from looking at it, but don't reference it as a source in your essay because, again, it's open to interpretation. A lot of people are going to take a lot of different things away from it, and why even bother with all that headache? Lastly, use the they say, I say tools that we studied in this class. We worked through that entire textbook to develop your synthesis skills. The template sentences that I had you guys take notes on, those are helpful, but the information that's presented in the chapters, that is invaluable. If you didn't read those chapters the first time or have forgotten them, try to go back and brush up on those valuable lessons before the test. You can still find all 11 chapters out on the Learning Hub in the Marking Period 4 folder. All right, that concludes this final review of the Q1 synthesis question. Good luck in your studies, and I'll see you in class.